The heart rate of a motoring enthusiast is driven by the soul and passion of performance cars. Among that panoply of performance cars, the name of McLaren shines brightly. From its track successes in Formula One, American Champ Cars and the Can-Am series, the company has built a reputation as a technological leader. With that heritage, the Mclaren F1 burst on the scene to take the crown as the finest and most significant sports car of the 20th century. As a result of its new level of technical values, the Mclaren F1 literally reinvented the category of the modern exotic car. It weighs nearly 40% less than a modern-day supercar and delivers almost 100 more horsepower. The result of this is a package that has made the F1 the world's fastest road-going automobile. It has a degree of utility never before seen in a car of its type. With its small shape, light weight, normally aspirated engine and low speed available torque, it navigates narrow, slow urban traffic with ease. And it seats 3 adults.
It's quiet when you want it to be quiet. It makes a wonderful howl when you want to really give it its head. It's very much a road car with a massive performance envelope. One of the great appeals about driving the McLaren is just the enjoyment from using the controls, savouring the smoothness and developing one's driving skill. And so I think the McLaren F1 will go down as the ultimate statement, as a pinnacle of high-performance motoring.
The idea behind the car is that it should be not only the ultimate car from the point of view of engineering, but for a driver's car. And to be the ultimate driver's car, it had to have, for me, a normally aspirated engine with a really good torque spread, compact, good visibility. Central driving position was absolutely essential because of the balance in driving quickly, as in a racing car, and be extremely stiff, light, and safe. And anything you put between the contact patch on the tyres and the driver's seat, hands and feet detracts from that experience. And therefore it was, very early on, it was decided not to use any form of assistance on the brakes, steering, gear change for instance. We considered semi-automatic gearbox, but it's a driver's car. We wanted to be a modern classic.
Our goal was to produce a vehicle that other people felt was the best in the world. It was conceived to be a vehicle that wasn't made regardless of cost, but was not driven by cost. And therefore we have been able to do things that would just not make commercial sense to a Ferrari or a Bugatti or a Diablo.
The philosophy of the F1 was to produce something that was totally involving. In every aspect it was totally involving. Whether it's in polishing the car and discovering that you enjoy polishing it because you enjoy the shape, sitting in it and enjoying that because you like the feel of the switches and you like the fact that the steering wheel is exactly where you want it to be. You can drive it slowly and it's still a lot of fun. Or you can go quicker than anybody else, and it's an enormous amount of fun.
If you are ever fortunate enough to ride in or drive an F1 sports car, then you'll understand quickly what performance is all about.
Ultra light, the F1 weighs in at 2,420 pounds, and it develops 627 horsepower with 479 pounds-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. In hot rod terms, it's through the quarter mile in 11.1 seconds, reaching 138 miles per hour. Accelerating from 0 to 60 miles an hour takes just 3.2 seconds. The 100-mile-an-hour mark comes up in 6.4 seconds. From 150 to a top speed of 240.1 miles an hour, the McLaren F1 out-accelerates a modern Grand Prix car. And all this at 15 miles to the gallon. and with its huge 13-inch disc brakes, the F1 stops from 70 miles per hour in 162 feet.
When it came to the choice for the engine, I was absolutely adamant that the car should have a normally aspirated engine of a reasonable capacity. And I was particularly keen to have a 12-cylinder, as that's the classic sports car engine, and for the lovely sounds they make. It's also a naturally balanced engine. A 60-degree V12 is a naturally balanced engine. And I spoke to several manufacturers. I was also aiming, though, for 100 horsepower per litre, which has never been achieved in a production car before. And eventually ended up with BMW Motorsport, who consistently produce engines of more than 90 horsepower per litre. What that gave me was an engine which originally had a target of 550 horsepower, an engine that's now producing over 620 horsepower, in a 1,000-kilogram car. It's fully dry sump lubricated for efficiency. It has an electronic system that's more sophisticated than anything that's ever been built before, and that was done by our in-house electronics company. It has variable valve timing, which constantly and instantly controls the valve angle on the inlet cams to bring the torque range way down to as low as 1,500 revs.
In charge of production at McLaren Cars is Derek Wayland.
Having such a large amount of torque, you're getting on for 500 foot-pounds of torque, that is quite amazing when you can drive the car very gently in top gear from 30 miles an hour to 230 miles an hour in the same gear. That really shows you the flexibility.
Part of the brief to the engine manufacturers at BMW was that it should meet California regulations, which a lot of people are saying are very difficult or if not impossible to meet. So we've produced an engine that produces more power per cc than any other performance engine in the history of road cars, and yet it's also the greenest.
Perhaps the most important and successful aspect of the McLaren F1 is in its packaging. Designing the car from the inside out guaranteed success on all fronts. By paying attention to the human shape at its core and by developing the close-coupled transmission, the car's format was established from its heart, its centerline.
It was decided without question from day one it was going to be a central seat car, and that the fuel tank was going to be behind the driver. That was kind of fixed stuff. So when one worked ahead of the driver, where his feet came decided where the axle line was going to be, so the front wheels positioned themselves. Gordon then knew that he wanted a minimum distance between the rear axle centerline and the back of the engine. So our wheelbase was defined. There we were, 107 inches, that was it.
With that layout determined and placed within the monocoque chassis structure, the F1 has almost no trade-offs. Despite having seating for 3, air conditioning, a 20-gallon tank and its enormous 6-litre V12, the F1's overall weight is right down, close to 1 ton. Add to that the enhanced emotional sensation the car delivers, even at low speeds, its ease of use in town, and luggage space for a couple of weeks' holiday.
The result of this packaging and layout is a car which has outstanding dynamic qualities and good poise and balance, and enough traction to control 627 horsepower.
The F1, like all sophisticated automobiles before it, is defined by its high level of technology.
Well, I think one of the big differences about the McLaren F1 is the fact that it has been built using genuinely 1990s technology. And I think one of the factors behind the McLaren F1 is that a lot of the supercars that were around in the middle of the 80s and towards the end of the 80s were ones that didn't really embody contemporary, state-of-the-art motorsport, motor racing technology. One of the reasons why the car is so expensive is because it really has embodied this state-of-the-art Formula One technology.
Because of its massive performance potential, active aerodynamic systems are employed on the F1 to balance the car at speed and under braking.
I was able to start with a clean sheet of paper again and say, right, what do you really need when the car brakes? And to overcome the excessive pitch you get from an emergency stop and the inevitable shift of weight and the aerodynamic center pressure forward, we have an active aerodynamic control system on the car which pops up a flap at the rear of the car, which not only doubles the downforce on each wheel, but doubles the downforce in the right proportion front to rear axle. So it helps stabilize the car, it instantly gives you more grip at each tire. Whereas ABS just stops the wheels locking. It doesn't actually enhance the braking power of the car.
The F1's active systems also utilize ground effects technology.
It has a ground effect system which is controlling and managing the airspeed under the car to produce a negative lift, a suction under the car, to help hold the car down. This is done by introducing air under the car and controlling it and managing it with the diffuser at the rear. The base suction, that is the low pressure vortex behind the car, which you get with any square back car or estate car for that matter, helps to suck the car through under the venturi and create the downforce. By flipping up the small wing, we actually increase the suction behind the car, therefore increase the flow underneath the car and enhance the downforce.
The technological developments of the F1 include designs that have been patented by McLaren cars. Some of these exclusive designs include the 3-passenger arrowhead cabin layout, the close-coupled gearbox design, and the automatic brake cooling system. The high level of technology found in the F1 is apparent in the treasure chest of exotic materials utilized in all facets of the car's construction.
The F1 has many materials that would not normally be found in a production road car.
The McLaren F1 uses exotic materials such as carbon fibre, uses Dyneema, uses aluminium honeycomb in its body construction. In the suspension we use exotic aluminium, which is heat treatable. In drive shafts, things such as Marangin steel, which is a very tough material that allows the drive shafts to flex. In the engine we use magnesium for lightness and strength. Also on the engine, we use Inconel, a sophisticated alloy for the exhausts, which literally is half the thickness and half the weight of a normal exhaust. We use titanium in lots of areas, such as the silencer, such as the throttle pedals and brackets and support activities.
The whole idea was that we should use the best possible material available to man at this time in the world for everything. And at one end of the scale, for instance, we tested all the heat shielding, because obviously this engine produces a massive amount of excess heat. And we found that the spacecraft material, 24-karat gold foil, was the best for radiated heat. In fact, all the materials, wherever we've approached any particular problem on the car, we've really had an open mind on materials. We did a little bit of styling and a lot of aerodynamic work, over 1,000 tests in the rolling road wind tunnel. And styling evolved as part of the process rather than dictating what the car should be.
Technology and performance get people excited about great cars, but it's usually the impact of a car's lines at first glance that creates the lasting mental impression. Stylist Peter Stevens created a distinctive shape, skillfully combining the car's refined yet brutal personality.
You know, the shape has to be one that respects what the air's doing at 200 miles an hour. I think that the F1 is deliberately understated. I like the fact that it's understated because the performance is such a startling statement. It doesn't need to brag about itself with its appearance. I mean, there was always this feeling with the car that at the front it should be very kind of simple, pure and organic, and it should become more technical as you move back down the car, as the pieces inside the car also became more technical. You start with the radiator, which is a fairly simple, straightforward piece of kit. So that bit of the car is simple and straightforward. You know, as you go through the front suspension, you get to the engine and the gearbox, it's getting a lot more complicated. And to a degree, I wanted to demonstrate that on the outside of the car.
Safety was another cornerstone of the F1's design philosophy. Again, the packaging and principal structure ensured success. It was this essential rigidity that had to be proven before the F1 could receive governmental production approval. A prototype was subjected to rigorous crash testing, which resulted in an interesting outcome.
In the standard crash test that we did, the car was crashed into a concrete block at 30 miles an hour, and had the car had an engine in that worked, it had a dummy engine, it was in such good structural integrity afterwards that it could have been driven away. The windscreen was intact, the doors were fine, even the front wheels were in the same position. It was quite remarkable.
Part of the F1's engineering for safety is certainly evident in the interior design. While at the centre of the heightened driving experience, the interior also delivers a substantial comfort zone for its inhabitants.
You feel you are in an extremely safe, cocoon-oriented environment in which you are totally positioned to take command. Whilst it is very powerful, it never instills in the driver a feeling of being unsafe.
Another unique feature of the interior, which is already packed with creature comforts, is the custom-engineered music system. Jonathan Palmer tried it out on the F1's initial high-speed run.
The music system is absolutely wonderful. It has been designed, of course, purposely for the car. It's been designed to be half the weight of the standard Kenwood system. And in fact, when we did that maximum speed run, I had the music going, I had the CD on at 200, just turned it down a bit and got on with a serious job of just building up those last 31 miles an hour.
With the McLaren F1's sophisticated technical pedigree, it was only a matter of time before it would be drawn into racing. With its legitimate street car origins, it was eligible for international GT racing. The new version would be known as the GTR. A ready customer base created a demand for the new car, and 28 highly engineered competition editions were built near the McLaren car's factory, where a new race shop was set up especially for the GTR competition program. Here at the shop, GTRs are prepared for customers. The suspension and brakes are beefier for the rigours of competition, while a racing transmission with straight-cut gears is also used. The interior is gutted and reinforced to become a racing-only capsule. Because of racing rules limitations, the engine is a detuned version of the street car's power plant. A special team of personnel was assembled to develop and test the GTR in the field and to provide customer service, for the racing program called for independent teams to campaign the cars. In the hands of these privateers, the F1 quickly showed its race car soul and won the burgeoning BPR GT Championship. In the Le Mans 24-hour race, the F1 won at its first attempt. An evolutionary GTR with high downforce bodywork was introduced later. BMW sponsored the factory team, which finished second in the FIA GT Championship in 1990. The F1 also took the GT1 Club at Le Mans in 1997. Through its racing life, the F1's balanced layout and massive linear power band proved how correct the design was. The racing world got a new dose of McLaren might, re-establishing the name in international sports car competition, and racing enthusiasts became even more appreciative of the McLaren heritage. Even with its competition successes and public accolades, the F1 had one more quest. It had to be clearly the fastest production road car ever manufactured, hopefully delivering a speed that will be extremely difficult to equal or surpass. On March 31st, 1998, an opportunity came to finally go for the all-time road car record. Let's ride in F1 prototype XP5 with endurance racing ace and Le Mans winner Andy Wallace on the Volkswagen Proving Ground in Germany. The 14-mile banked oval circuit that includes 150-mile-an-hour corners is as good as it gets for such an extreme high-speed record attempt.
Okay, that was just a short burst from the parking area to the first banking. Reached around about 330. The car very stable. Doing around 215 on the banking. And then we're now going on the return leg. It's not straight, there's a few corners here. We're now doing 270, 280, 290, 300, 310, 320, 330, 340, 350, 355. The car is moving a little bit on the road. $360, $367, $373, $378, okay, 379 was the maximum seen. Now slowing down, going to take the banking at the far end. I'm now doing 260, it feels like I'm not even moving. The car's very, very stable. What a wonderful machine this is. Well, one thing's for sure, I'm very lucky to be able to drive such a wonderful car as this. And I think it will be quite a long time before somebody else makes one to better this one. It is superb. Okay, here we are on the banking. This is the banking at the close end to the car park, doing around 215 kilometers per hour. I'm going to accelerate now down the return leg. We have 300 kilometers per hour, 320, 340, 350, 360, 370, 377, 381, 383, 383, 384, and then backing off again. 384 maximum. We're very, very close to the rev limiter now. Okay, we're now doing 301 kilometers per hour, and it feels like you can get out and walk by the side of the car now, strangely enough. Okay, we are again on the banking close to the parking. We're doing 230 kilometers per hour on the banking now. And as we come off, we're going to be accelerating up to the maximum speed. So we now have 250, 280, 300, 320, 340, 350, 360, 370, 379, 381, 382, 383, 385, 386, 387, 388, 388. And we got a corner coming up, so we're slowing down. Gearbox temperature reached 118 degrees that time. Now we're slowing down to just over 200. On the banking at the far end, 215, 230, 240, 270, 300, 330, 350, 360, 370, 380, 386, 388, 389, 390, 390, 391, 391. It will not go any more than 391. Anyway, 391's quite fast, isn't it? Appropriately, we've got the fuel light on. Gearbox temperature reached 130 degrees. Everything else is fine. I still say this is the best car ever built, ever, and probably will never be beaten.
As exciting as the F1 itself is, so is the story of its origins and prototype development. Let's go back and watch the exclusive, never-before-seen home video of the making of this amazing 20th century automobile. The spirit found in the F1 can be traced back through 36 years of racing successes to company founder Bruce McLaren. His strengths resulted in the company's engineering-based foundation. This continuity of expertise has consistently delivered solidly crafted competition cars that have won championships in the highest echelon of sports car and open-wheel racing. McLaren's first road-going GT was the 1969 M6 GT. And the tradition lives on today at McLaren cars. The idea for the F1 was a natural for McLaren. With the company's executive brains trust being serious racers, it was only a matter of time.
The idea of building a high-performance sports car originally was instilled in the vision of Mansour Roget, who is my partner and the primary shareholder in the TAG McLaren Group. Our goal was to produce a vehicle that other people felt was the best in the world. I think the final vehicle was very much driven by Gordon's central driving position.
Way back in the 60s, in my college days, when I used to do many layouts for sports cars, racing cars and road cars, I had an idea for a three-seater layout with the driver in the centre and the two passengers offset to the rear and to the side. And in those days I used to fill my college sketchbooks with such ideas. And here we are many years later in one of the prototype McLaren F1s with just that layout.
The huge undertaking of launching a new car, much less one with the F1's technical goals, was executed by an amazingly small but highly talented team.
We set out to build the F1 in a very short time, really, by normal car standards, a very short overall time. And to do that you have to set very difficult targets to drive everybody forward. We have a very good, strong team of people on the design team and on the build team for the car, but they still do need targets. The McLaren F1, the car that we ended up with, is really a result of a lot of different processes, and they generally happen concurrently. To get the program done in the time scale that we did, and with between 5 and 8 designers on the program, we had to overlap massively on styling models and wind tunnel models, seating bucks, packaging, full-size tape drawings. All those processes overlap and feed off one another. And they have to be carefully managed, obviously, because the information that you use from one process to the other has to be at the right time in the program and with the right particular expert for that area, talking to all the other people to coordinate the process to make sure that you hit the timescale.
Gordon and I set the company up at the very end of 1989 and started to put together a team of designers and specialists to get the project underway. We had to start from scratch, going into an empty building, design the car, do all the development research, build the prototype, all within a period of 3 years. And that in itself was pretty hard going, but we did it.
In the sophisticated arena of launching a world-class automobile, McLaren scored another major success by taking a road less travelled in the design concept.
I picked a package that is the size of the car. What I wanted in the car is regards 3 grown-up people, the luggage, the amount of fuel, the size of the engine and transmission, size of the wheels and tyres, the major components. And that was our Bible. We stuck to that size and that package, and it was immovable. You know, there was nothing that could happen during the design process. Say the car should be bigger, wider, heavier. We also set ourselves a very lightweight target of 1,000 kilos dry, which is some 400 or 500 kilos lighter than an equivalent supercar.
The result of this design concept was what ultimately put the F1 in a new class of the exotic car genre. Before any design concepts could be realised, studies had to be done to prove the ideas would actually work.
At the same time we're doing wind tunnel work and wind tunnel models, we're working on what we call a seating butt, which is a timber car frame effectively to check out the ergonomics and the actual geometry of the cabin as regards things like ingress and access, getting in and out, instruments, visibility, all those sorts of things. In fact, there's a very early seating butt we did in the program just to prove that the central driving position was viable. Because the program was very secretive, we actually used everybody in the company, including directors like Ron and Mansour, as guinea pigs, if you like, to come along and get in and out of the car and check visibility and just very basic things like shoulder widths and hip widths and comfort factors on the ergonomics. The seating butt develops from an early, fairly crude model to something more sophisticated as the packaging and the engineering and the wind tunnel models feed back information into the main car design. So the seating butt will actually develop through several iterations during the course of the car design until we get to what we call a styling seating butt. And one of our prime objectives was that the car should be the ultimate driver's car. For that to be right, the ergonomics have to be right, and for the ergonomics have to be right, then the seating butt is a very important early part of the process.
With the undertaking of building a prototype automobile from scratch, how can you engineer parts for a car that doesn't yet exist? The question is answered by building test vehicles. At McLaren Cars, they were affectionately known as Albert and Edward.
Well, to start with, we had many months, as I just mentioned, sorting out the packaging of the car, the interior cockpit layout, and then the overall dimensions and suspension and everything else which was required before we finally started to put the whole thing together. So for the first year and a half, it was just pure design work. And at the same time, we had two what we call mule cars running, which were not genuine F1s. They were adapted from somebody else's multitubular design, just so we could do special work and development on such things as transmission, brakes, etc., and get plenty of mileage on it before we started to build the definitive car.
Albert, it's affectionately known as Albert, the first one, was a space frame car using a large American V8 engine, because that's the only thing I could find that had enough torque to prove the gearbox. That was a car that was built purely to test early transmissions and to choose the sizes of the brakes for the car, because until you've actually sized the brakes, you can't draw the suspension, and then you can't finalize the detail design on the car. So it's all really wrapped up together. So Albert was very useful in checking brake sizes, brake performance, and later transmission performance. After Albert, we built a second mule car, which we called Edward, and that car used the correct V12 engine for the car, because by that time we had an early prototype engine, and we needed to do a lot of the early engine work, such as starting to get the drivability correct, the emissions, which would later be very important for the regulations. We needed to get a lot of that work underway, and of course we didn't have a finished running car because that was still being tooled with the tooling stack at that stage. So we built Edward, and Edward actually was a very useful test bed to do all the early engine and transmission work on the car. We got a lot of emissions work done on Edward. Because the car it was a very personal thing anyway, and because I really wanted it to be the ultimate driver's car, I actually did a lot of the testing with all the cars myself, including some of the early work with the Albert and Edward mule cars. I drove Edward in the early days to check things like drivability of the engine and early performance of the engine. We had test drives, of course, to do long-term testing and durability testing.
With the mechanical engineering developments in progress and the principal packaging dimensions signed off, it would normally be time to style the car. The team's approach was again to go its own way. They chose to determine aerodynamic stability from an amorphous shape first, and to apply styling over that developed shape as the last exercise.
After we've actually set the packaging parameters for the car, that is the cabin size for instance, and the overall size and wheelbase of the car, the first thing then to do is a wind tunnel model. We approached it slightly differently from a normal manufacturer. They'd start with styling models. We didn't do that. We went straight from primary packaging, occupant packaging, engine packaging, overall size, into a slightly amorphous wind tunnel model, which had the cabin size fixed and the overall car size fixed, but the rest of the shape was not really styled at all. It was just the shape that you think is going to be around the right sort of shape to be aerodynamic and not produce enough lift. So that's your basic wind tunnel model. You then go into the tunnel and do a few hundred tests. In fact, we use the rolling road tunnel that the Formula 1 team uses. You go into the tunnel, you do a few hundred tests just to get an idea on the amount of lift the car will produce, the amount of drag it will produce, where the centre of pressure of the downforce or the lift, if the car's lifting, is on the car. You start getting an idea on if you've got the cooling openings about right, fairly general stuff. That's the first tunnel model.
The car's stylist, Peter Stevens, was a major contributor to this pre-styling phase.
Our first few, I suppose, I don't know, 6 or 7 days at the wind tunnel were spent matching these different front and rears just to get the basic shape as efficient as we could. It's where you get a kind of feel for what the air's doing, you know, and you can get a feel for how the air wants to pass over the car, and you can get a feel for the fact that if you force it to do something it doesn't want to do, it just plain doesn't work. You can't stick arrows on the car and say, please go this way. You know, the air will go where it chooses to. But at the same time, one of the exciting things with the tunnel is that you can then find a trend which is perhaps different from what you expected, and that means that you're then making bits in the wind tunnel, and you have to be kind of efficient to quickly make little bits and pieces and change things. Because what you're looking for with this kind of car is not so much kind of bald figures of improvement. You're looking for a trend. You're looking for the fact that if you start changing the radius of the rear end in a certain way, then suddenly the car starts to generate lift instead of downforce at the back. And that's a kind of trend. You're not necessarily looking to define early on that radius to within a mil or half a mil, because it's an expensive business and the time is pretty precious in the wind tunnel. You do a lot of preparation work beforehand. You'll take a whole kit of bits that your previous experience has shown you want to try on the car. So we would have taken diffusers for the back that were adjustable in a whole range of different positions.
In order to understand the wind's actions on the emerging changes, a multitude of experiments were required.
You have to stop and do every now and again, particularly if you've made a whole bunch of changes in the wind tunnel. You have to see what that's done to the general flow of the air. And there are a number of different ways we did that. I mean, a way that I like quite often to do is a single strand of wool on a tuft. And it's a fairly long strand, so it demonstrates the way that the air is generally passing across the surface. You have little short strands which show you what's happening right on the surface, and they tend to show you whether you're generating turbulence and that kind of thing. If it's turbulent, then they're waggling about. If the flow's good, then they're staying pretty straight. The long strand is used to see the kind of general quality over the surface. But then there's another thing which we do which irritates the tunnel operatives, because it's kind of messy, and we do stuff with fluorescent inks on the car, and then you can use ultraviolet light which shows up spectacularly what the air has done to the ink that you put on the front of the car, because it passes across the surface in exactly the way that the airstream is going, and then the ink dries out, you put your ultraviolet light on it, and there's this wonderfully clear picture of what the air has done all the way across, especially fairly complex details of the car, where it would be impossible with something like a wool tuft to get fine enough interpretation.
After arriving at a sound aerodynamic foundation through wind tunnel experiments, a second, more detailed wind tunnel model is brought in, and the multifaceted process of styling begins.
The whole process of the styling side of the car is in many forms. One of them is a three-dimensional model. Another one is just quick sketches, just to get detail ideas down onto a bit of paper and push them around amongst ourselves. And then you have the full-size tape drawings, which are our big flat full-size drawings on the wall of the office, where you can stand back and see the car in its real size.
With over 1,100 hours in the wind tunnel and all this flurry of styling in 3/10 scale, it's time to say yes and move on to a full-scale styling model. From 2.5 tons of clay, a full-scale three-dimensional styled shape emerges.
And as the car goes full size, from the 3/10 size, you do start changing quite a few detailed things. They might just be highlights over the surface, or they might be the way the shut lines look, for instance. Because when you get something in full size, it just takes on a different scale and a different sort of balance.
The car at full scale is then tested in the wind tunnel to check, among other things, stability and low pressure areas. After so many phases of being able to change and modify the shape, now is the scary part: to commit to the styling that will become the final silhouette of the tooling body master. After the styling, the body tooling phase and the mechanical engineering developments are completed, the next phase of assembling the first complete prototype begins.
One of the intermediate targets was the first day the car would run. Initially that was set for the end of January in '93, and at quite a late stage I moved that forward to just before Christmas. And that actually made what was already a very difficult target almost unrealistically hard to achieve. But everybody rose to the occasion fantastically well. And in fact we ended up by working, the whole team ended up by working all through the night for 2 nights leading up to the 23rd, with everybody getting their hands dirty and mucking in and getting the car running. We actually achieved a run on the 23rd, even though it was only a few hundred yards, but the feeling of achievement for everybody in the company, and myself of course, to actually get in the car for the first time and fire it up and drive it away after all the dreams and the hard work and blood, sweat and tears, was amazing. I mean, it really was. That was probably, of all the high points in the program, the 23rd of December was probably the best.
Hovering round the first F1, which was dubbed XP1, Experimental Prototype Number 1, is a staff of 20 people from all departments. Design, engineering and mechanical all contribute their respective expertise to the assembly of the first car. The sleeping giant comes together as the brake system is filled with fluid and an initial engine start check is made. The front suspension is worked on, wheels and tyres go on, dash elements are fitted in place. Next to be added are the doors, and finally the nose section is attached. 6,000 hours from its original inception, the first Mclaren F1 prototype comes to life. Bringing the first Mclaren F1 experimental prototype XP1 to fruition through the creative design process of the team was a considerable accomplishment in its own right. Now the project would accelerate through more pre-production thresholds on the way to developing a refined customer vehicle.
The next real target after getting the car running on the 23rd for the first time was to have a proper run somewhere on a closed circuit, to allow the other directors to drive the car and also to run the car a little harder and to start seeing just how well the cooling performed, for instance.
Silverstone, site of many historic British races, was chosen for the XP1's first test. With little fanfare, the car was rolled out for the test. The worthiness of the design and all its components would now have to prove itself. The cooling system, the measures to deal with the heat from the massive V12, and of course, the braking and handling. The seriousness of XP1's first test was tempered by the presence of another Gordon Murray creation, the whimsical rocket road car, which, while it makes people smile, is a star performer in its own right. On hand for the test were other directors, including Ron Dennis and Mansour Ojeh, who were there to drive the car for the first time. Technical Director Murray was worried that his fellow company executives would be seduced by XP1's huge performance envelope.
We set a date, I think, in February, where all the directors, Mansour Ojeh and Ron Dennis, Crichton Brown, as is Ojeh, and myself would drive the car. And I gave them all a a talk before we set off, because I was a bit worried that the car hadn't been run in anger, and that we should actually take it easy for a few laps. But of course, we're all racers at heart, and after 2 laps, I think Vincent Auger was doing 150 miles an hour past the pits. The car ran very well that first day, and we all came back pretty elated with what we'd all achieved.
After the first impressions and inspiring high-speed sprints of XP1, a testing program was initiated that would last for a year. Over the 12 months, 5 prototypes were manufactured and put into the field. The firstborn youngster XP1 was totally destroyed in engine mapping trials in Africa. On August 1st, 1993, McLaren Formula One driver Mika Hakkinen took the car to 220 miles an hour. Just a week later, Jonathan Palmer reached 231 miles an hour on the high-speed test track at Nardo in Italy.
We went through a whole range of test schedules covering everything through the engine, the gearbox, the chassis, the brakes, the aerodynamics, the tyres. Well, the first time that I drove a prototype was in about February 1993. And I drove the car around, and it was incredible. And Gordon was there. I still remember, I just came into the pit there and opened up the door, and Gordon sort of raised his eyebrows. I just said, awesome, absolutely awesome. The great thing about the car is that it wasn't just the ultimate power, the torquiness of the engine just defied belief. It was difficult to know which gear you were in.
The Belgian Pavé test has an enormous durability factor, that is sort of actual miles done to road miles that you would normally do in just a long distance durability run. A normal production car can get totally destroyed in 1,000 miles, for instance, with all the spot welds falling apart and all the mechanical elements of the car falling to pieces. We did a week's work on the Pavé testing, which is pretty horrendous stuff for the chassis and the suspension.
With the rigours of prototype testing accomplished and the car's production specification locked in, the next phase, that of building customer cars, was begun.
The manufacturing process of McLaren cars is a very long process. It starts from the initial body construction. We start from buying the carbon thread from the manufacturers. We then have it woven to our own requirements and own patterns and own different weaves, and we receive it in rolls of pre-impregnated fibre. We then cut those impregnated carbon into patterns, very similar to a dressmaking type of pattern, where you lay computer-generated shapes over the carbon, and we then have them laser cut out into the different sizes or hand cut according to the requirements. There are about 130 different components that make up the body, so the 5,000 odd patterns are laid into these moulds. They are laid in layers, in different mixes, different weaves, different orientations. Then the whole mould is transferred to an autoclave. An autoclave is an enormous pressure chamber. A pressure chamber that also can be heated up to 150 odd degrees C and about 90 pounds per square inch. Those components are then brought out of those. Most of them are almost ready to use because the moulds produce the edges to the correct sizes, and the holes, a lot of the holes are actually in the mould. All those components are then progressively built up into small sub-assemblies and larger sub-assemblies, and the things like the whole central monocoque is done as a separate assembly, and the doors, bonnets, the engine covers, All those are then pre-fitted as a pre-fit exercise to ensure that all of the fits and finishes are correct. All those components then arrive back here. Here is a very nice facility, and I wanted to develop an assembly philosophy, an assembly building that was like no other. And clearly I wanted to literally assemble the car in an office environment with no thoughts of garages or garage implements. Even the lift that lifts the car up for assembly is sunken into the floor, completely like an iceberg. All of the work's under the floor. The factory is immaculately clean, whether it's on the top of the units or not, and that's a philosophy we have throughout all of our assembly here. The car is assembled on 5 stations, progressively improving the amount of parts that go onto the car. We start off clearly with the body, the main monocoque structure. We fit into it things like main water pipes and harnesses, and we've attached things like the gold foil that is for heat protection. Progressively going through the assembly, we then put the engine, gearbox into the car. When the car is then dropped onto its wheels, the doors and all of the opening parts are finally assembled. The philosophy of manufacturing is very lean and mean. We have all of our stock are in the units behind us and around the walls of the assembly hall. We have no stores, we have no big place to put stock. We work just in time, and that clearly is beneficial for everybody.
With the F1's production method, the definition of hand-built and time-consuming is taken to new heights.
The body construction facility at our Shelford factory, we employ approximately 85 people at that facility. So from the time we bring the raw material and cut it into its templates to the time it goes to the paint shop, there's about 3,400 hours. In the assembly facility here, we have about 23 people. It takes about 2,000 hours at the moment to assemble the car. We are progressively reducing that. Totally, there's about 129 people in manufacturing.
Despite its elite pedigree and limited accessibility, the F1 is like any other contemporary culture icon. Ultimately, its worth is determined by how it plays on the street.
I'd love one.
It's just the best car in the world. I think it's small. I like small cars.
It's unbelievable. If I had the money, I'd get one, yeah, absolutely. I don't think a student loan would cover it, though.
Yeah, one of those, Josh?
It's very good.
I'd like the keys.